Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor in New York, Adam Tooze.
Hi, Cam.
So, before we get to the data points, one last plug for our live show that is coming up in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, September 17th. It's at the beautiful Sixth and I Synagogue venue. There are still tickets available for that, so if you're considering coming, if you've been thinking about it, now's the time. You can find the link in our show notes. We hope to see you all there. So, the data points. The second half of the show, we're going to be talking about former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was in the news here in the United States, or there in the United States, I suppose I should say, for some strange reasons relating to the presidential campaign. So we'll get to that in a second. But first, data point of 25, as in 25 basis points, which is the amount by which the U.S. Federal Reserve is expected to lower interest rates next week when it's scheduled to make an announcement about interest rates.
U.S. inflation cooled again in August, with overall prices rising at an annual rate of 2.5%, the lowest level in more than 3 years. Christine Romans is here. Christine, this is good news, but maybe with a catch.
I think they're going to cut. Unsurprisingly, 25 basis points is our call. I know there's a lot of back and forth in markets now between 25 and 50. The last jobs report was fine. It was well above something weak like 100.
Obviously, interest rates have been elevated for a while. They were introduced to slow inflation a couple of years ago, but now markets are expecting them finally to drop after data has come in about a weakened labor market and more general signs of a potential recession on the horizon in the United States. So yeah, we thought we'd take a look at what exactly now the Fed's decision consists of and what the effects might be for the U.S. and the rest of the world. So, Adam, everyone now is expecting at this point a rate cut. But I wanted to ask about what the practical effects of that interest rate cut might be. I mean, in a macro sense, how quickly does a drop in interest rates by the Fed get translated into greater aggregate demand? I mean, that is ultimately the lever that's getting worked here economically. And maybe if we were to look at that on a more micro scale, from a consumer's perspective, from someone who's sitting in the U.S. right now, how will this interest rate decision get translated into their everyday lives? I mean, will it get easier to get a mortgage, for example, to buy a house? Is that what consumers can expect from this?
So this is the question that economists call the transmission mechanism question, and that was the subject of the technical side of the Jackson Hole meeting towards the end of this summer. We discussed this issue on the way up in the tightening cycle, and it's interesting now to be considering it on the way down. I was reflecting on the fact that I think the podcast has accompanied this entire inflation price shock period, followed by the monetary policy response. So it's an interesting moment to look back on this. The basic message, I think, is not to expect too much too quickly. If interest rates come down by 25 basis points, that's 1/4%. There is a big margin between what the Fed charges banks through various mechanisms, which is the interest rate we're talking about here that's being pulled down, and the rates which banks charge to consumers. If the interest rate continues to fall, people believe that mortgage rates could fall. Well, initially, I think hover around 6% for a while before falling into the range of 4.5 to 5.5%. And that's a relatively modest fall. But what a very interesting paper that was discussed at Jackson Hole revealed is that in the background, on the supply side of mortgages, interesting things happen when interest rates are moved by the Fed. And what was going on during the tightening phase as interest rates went up is that banks tended to sell their existing portfolios of mortgage-backed securities. They were less attractive to hold as the overall interest rate went up. And so that tended to amplify the effect of raising interest rates, because as you sell the mortgage-backed securities, the value of the bonds goes down, the yield that's necessary to hold them goes up, and the entire tightening process begins to operate in the wrong direction. What you might hope for on the reverse side, as the Fed lowers interest rates, is that the reverse mechanism begins to kick in. And so we might see an easing of mortgage credit as interest rates nudge down that would, in fact, provide a powerful mechanism of support above and beyond the effect on consumers of slightly lower interest rates. So there is a mechanism there which is unraveling and may feed through to a positive shock to mortgage credit in coming months and years.
Okay, so if we were to shift now to the size of this interest rate decrease, I've been reading about predictions about the size of the cut, and there seems to be a consensus that it'll likely be 25 basis points, as I said at the outset with the data point. But there have also been suggestions that 50 basis points could be useful based on the data that's come in about the condition of the economy. And at the same time, there's also a discussion that larger decrease, 50 basis points, half a percentage point, that could be interpreted in the financial markets as a sign that the Fed is panicking. And that could itself become an economic problem, according to these analyses. And I'm curious how to understand this discussion because, is this really a question of the empirical marginal difference that the resulting rates would really make in the economy? Or is there something else at work here about how interest rates work? I mean, is this kind of a psychological speculation by financial markets about the interpretation of what this interest rate decrease means? In which case, rather than the Fed panicking, isn't it the markets themselves that are being revealed to be irrational? I mean, how do we make sense of this, Adam?
I mean, the shock effect of a 50 basis point, a half percentage point cut is definitely a psychological one. But between the two sort of interpretations you offered, which was empirical on the one hand, the effect of a half percentage point on the economy or the state of the labor market, and then on the other hand, what you posited was psychological speculation. I think we need some intermediary space, which is where the real economy is situated. Above all, we need, I think, the word expectations, which is what you're going to hear tossed around the whole time. And the focus on expectations in modern economics derives from the fact that the economy is really empirically, objectively hardwired in all of those heavy terms, a system in which the future matters. And the thing about the future is that we don't know what it's going to be until it happens. And the best that we have are models, and roughly speaking, all we have about it are expectations. And this isn't a sort of psychological weakness or a sign of neurosis or tendency towards hysteria or something. This is literally just the case that every single important economic decision has a contemporary and a future-orientated element on which really the ultimate value of the decision that you make depends. And so in very realistic, very empirical, objectively necessary ways, economic activity hinges on a collective conversation about what the future is going to look like, which none of us can know for certain. We can try and make things true. We can build stuff that will still be around in 10 years' time, but we don't know what it'll be worth because that will depend on whether or not people want to buy the goods that come out of factories that we now think have value, but in future might not. And that will depend on a whole bunch of conditions. So this conversation that's going on in the markets about the meaning of any one actor moving, and especially the Fed moving, is not merely a speculative thing. It's an existential condition. You can't escape this. And what markets do is they look around and say, okay, who knows stuff around here? Like, where are the tells? Who are the actors who might reasonably be expected to know things about the actual world and therefore to be better informed about making guesses about the future? This is what people mean when they say that markets economize on information, because you don't need to know yourself. You just need to be able to spot the people who clearly do know. And in this case, the Fed, which for very good reason, because it's the pinnacle of the credit system, of the dollar system, and therefore of the world, is not unreasonably thought to be a very powerfully informed actor. And if the Fed says, what we need to do is we need to cut by half a percentage point, not by a quarter, that's telling you something very important about what the people on the highest available hill looking into the future can see. And us further down the hill look up at them and go, oh, look how they're changing. Well, then we ought to adjust our expectations accordingly, right? And this effect, it's inescapable. You can't avoid it. And that's why this choice matters. And it's not merely a kind of ephemeral thing. It's a structural condition of how modern any economy works. And so it's an important decision. I mean, it depends what setting you're in. In really high pressure moments of actual crisis where the future is massively uncertain, this can become a matter of nearly life and death for an economy. How signals from the key actors are interpreted. America's economy is a long way removed from that. So what we're really saying is a move to a 0.5 percentage point would cause a more dramatic revision of expectations than's already going on. I think we should step away from the language of panic, but it would certainly be a serious signal that someone in the Fed sees something. It'll be about the labor market, which they've already informed everyone, is their central preoccupation right now at Jackson Hole. They're not worried about inflation anymore. They really are worried about the labor market. They must be seeing something somewhere or have some analysis in their system that is telling them, what the labor market situation is. It's cooling. Unemployment's rising more quickly. We expect it to rise even more quickly over time. We should act. And that's what's going on here. It's important, I think, to give the due weight to this notion of expectations, because it makes economics, a far more interesting, something rather different from a branch of engineering, which is how people imagined economics potentially might be in the 50s and 60s. There was quite a lot of hope, if you like, that it could be like engineering or weather forecasting or something like that. And that's clearly not what economics is, because it's a form of knowledge about a collective social system.
Got it. Although there is something kind of head spinning about this, almost like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its tail. Because who is the sovereign actor then when it comes to setting these expectations that you're talking about? I mean, in some ways, in the way we're describing this, it's the financial markets looking to the Fed for expectations. But it's just as well the Fed now that could be calibrating its actions based on its expectations of how financial markets will react to them. And
which is why, along with expectations, another key term in the vocabulary of modern central banking is credibility. Because credibility is a measure, if you like, of the extent to which folks think of the Fed as a robust, autonomous actor somehow outside this loop you're describing. That's, in a sense, what credibility describes, and independence along with it, right? So independence, credibility are the kind of the way in which we characterize the Fed as an actor in the face of a world which, exactly as you say, has this, A, it's reflexive, and B, the whole thing is driven by a weird cocktail of both real, as best as we hope it is, real data about things which are actually happening, and collective expectations about the future, which has not yet transpired.
So what does seem clear is that next week we will begin exiting a period of what has been elevated U.S. interest rates. And I'm curious if we were to take a step back and consider the global effects of this period of relatively high interest rates. What have the international effects been? A few come to mind when I think about it. If countries elsewhere in the world that borrow in dollars, that service their debt, their national debt in dollars, I imagine that they have had higher servicing costs, and that their debt has become more expensive as a result of these decisions made by the Fed. But I imagine there are other effects as well, and maybe even political instability that's been produced around the world in this period of higher interest rates. What is your perspective on that, Adam?
Yeah, it starts with a price shock where you have a tiered global hierarchy of interest rates, with the Germans paying least of all for government debt and the Americans somewhat above the Germans, unsurprisingly, given their fiscal and debt positions, and then Latin American borrowers, Asian borrowers somewhere in the middle, and African borrowers at the top. And if the US is paying 3-4%, then African borrowers might be paying 10% plus. So that's, first of all, the price side, and the consequence of that then, as those prices for emerging market and low-income borrowers, the cost of borrowing, the interest rate they pay, the yield, in other words, the relationship between the price of a bond that you issue, the amount of money you raise, and the interest rate you end up paying, all of that goes in the wrong direction as the Fed raised interest rates. What happened was that debt markets shut down on a two-sided way, and the ones people weren't willing to lend, because you can see that a borrower can't really service debt to that interest rate, and borrowers decide to step out of the market. So if you look at something like the Euro bond market, which is a market that many emerging and low-income markets countries were tapping by issuing debt. The debt issued there collapsed over the period 2022 to 2023. This was an IMF chart recently. It collapsed by 70% relative to the pre-shock period. So those countries are only able to borrow. These are low-income and emerging market countries, only able to borrow $40 billion as opposed to $170 billion. Many countries actually experienced net outflows. In other words, they were paying back more in interest and principal than they were able to newly borrow. So overall, the market was sucking financial resources out of low-income countries on a very large scale. Within this sample set that the IMF was looking at, a third, 26 of 75 countries experienced net Eurobond outflows to the tune of 58 billion. And that then produces debt crisis. And debt crises are crises because they are both a debt and a financial problem, but also the politics then of debt service, the priorities of public spending, and the pressure to raise taxes explode into the political arena. And from Bolivia to Kenya to Sri Lanka to Argentina to Pakistan, we have seen those kind of effects rippling through the world economy. So when we in the US talk about a soft landing, we should check ourselves for a second and just consider for a moment the vast majority of humanity for whom this American interest rate hike delivered a really very, very painful blow. And it's those countries also which were slowest to recover from COVID and have now suffered the double whammy of COVID, followed by the interest rate hike driven by the price shock of COVID in the rich world. And so their recovery from COVID has been lame by comparison with the extraordinary rebound in the US.
So obviously these ripple effects have been very vast around the world, and they all come down to decisions made in Washington in the Federal Reserve, and specifically by the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who it seems fair to say has considerable political power, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And I'm curious now how we could assess Powell as a political leader. I mean, what sort of political leader has he been revealed to be through this period, through his decisions made in this period? Is he someone who has acted consciously of his political power and its possibilities, or has he been more of a conventional, thoroughly technocrat, so to speak?
So at a personal level, Powell is by all accounts charming, and his career is based on his political skills. I mean, he was brought onto the Fed by the Obama administration because he was thought to be a highly cooperative and effective player with the Republican Congressional Caucus, which was already going crazy in the 2010s in the Tea Party moment. And Powell was somebody who could explain to the Tea Party folks why it would be a terribly bad idea if America defaulted on its debt. He's a Republican, but he was one that you could do business with. And that appears to have continued throughout his incumbency as chair. He has assiduously worked Congress. And this marks a very sharp, moving beyond the level of personalities, break with the immediate run of predecessors in the era in which we think of, the Fed as this towering institution of monetary policy globally, in the essentially post-Bretton Woods era in which national monetary policy becomes this key variable, which it is to a much lesser extent when you're under a fixed exchange rate system. So since the 70s, if you think of the sequence, Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, these are people who are, had prestige in part because of their savvy as economists. And Powell really makes no secret of the fact that he isn't somebody who's an economist, right? He has a career in banking and private finance, and then he's somebody who knows how to work Congress. He comes from the DC network. He's that kind of insider. And I think beyond his personality and the politics of his appointment under Trump, because Trump picked him over Yellen, didn't give Yellen a second term, I think what this signifies is something quite paradoxical or dialectical, in the sense that he is acting this way and he's suitable for the moment, in part because it became obvious that very consensual elite integrating politics was essential to allow the Fed increasingly to do quite radical things when it came to economic policy. So first in response to COVID and then in the aftermath, Powell has really normalized the era of radical interventions that began under Bernanke, you could say under Volcker with the interest rate shock, but in the form of QE under Bernanke. And when the chips were down in 2020, Powell was a really revolutionary central banker in the sheer scale of the interventions. And it's almost as though, and I think it's explicit in his mind, is that to make that kind of central banking possible, you need political integration and political backing, and that's what he works very assiduously to deliver. So there's, as it were, expert economists, there are technicians of monetary policy at the Fed, and he is the ambassador of the central banking system to the American political system, to Capitol Hill. And I think that in itself, that is the role of the central bank. You see there's a degree of analogy to Christine Lagarde's role at the ECB. I wrote a piece for On Policy, actually, back when these things were being discussed, that the emergence of these lawyer figures essentially as keys to the central banking system is a reflection of structural change, which has become more and more radical at the level of policy making in response to a series of really dramatic shocks. And then, as it were, needs to provide itself with political legitimacy. And so you need central bankers who are good politicians.
Well, I guess if I were to conclude this segment with a more specific political question and how Powell handled it, I'm curious whether we'll eventually potentially look back at this period and say that the Federal Reserve may have cost Democrats the presidential election by not lowering interest rates soon enough. Obviously, there are now glimmers of a potential recession, a weakening economy. Perhaps if the Fed acted sooner, the Democrats would have a better chance in the coming election. So could we say that the Fed may have mishandled this in some way from a political perspective?
I think that would be very unfair to the Fed, to be honest. I really do. I was struggling a little bit with this question. I mean, they were very slow to raise interest rates in the first place because they were prioritizing the labor market. And I think, you could fault them for not acting one cycle earlier, one meeting earlier. But I think, I don't think that will be a plausible interpretation. Apart from anything else, part of the issue is that American voters don't seem particularly responsive to the macroeconomic record right now. And so the argument that, even a half percentage point move earlier, I think would have set alarm bells ringing and would have shifted the narrative towards, hard landing. And that would certainly not have been in the interests of the incumbents. I think then the Republicans would have spun a story of inflation disaster followed by hard landing. We told you so, or something like that. So I don't see that. And I think, they may even have hesitated to move in the moment they are moving because it's so close to an election and you don't necessarily want to be seen to be cutting rates, literally within weeks of a vote. But I think they are trying to be what they call data dependent, data driven. And right now the labor market numbers just, they're not terrifying. It's not a nightmare, but I think they are worried that the American economy is going to slow down too hard, too fast. So that's why they're acting when they are.
Fair enough. I suppose my question was motivated by whether the Fed's decisions should also be incorporating political expectations and political criteria in some way. I mean, Donald Trump has vowed to end the Fed's independence if he becomes president again. And now that's a predictable outcome of this coming election. And I don't know if it's fair to evaluate the Fed's actions on that basis, to expect them to consider those political factors in making decisions that could affect the election one way or the other.
That already happened. So that already happened. So Dudley at the New York Fed actually went out on a limb and said precisely that, which is that, Donald Trump's erratic commentary on trade and investment was, econometric studies were done to show that his tweets had an impact on the world economy. And if that's the case, and so then that's part of the function which the Fed is trying to manage, then the Fed obviously has, you could say, almost a responsibility to ensure that risk is minimized. And so ensuring that Donald Trump did not take office would be part of the Fed's legitimate mission. And that's a spiral no one wants to get themselves into. I mean, in running the other way around, I actually believe we've spoken about this before, but running the other way around when we're talking about left-wing governments, conservative central bankers historically have not been shy of saying precisely that they considered it their mission to guard, freedom, the free market against interventionist governments. And if a left-wing government were to come a cropper on a sharp interest rate increase, well, so what? But running the other way around, I think that's a step too far. And I think they're probably it's too obvious. It's too obviously concerning that the Trump side of making, talking the way they are at the possibility of curbing Fed independence. I think the last thing they want to do is to add to the politics of the moment.
Got it. Well, we still have a few weeks until we would know which way the election will go, but we do have to take a break here for now. We will be back in a second, though, to talk about Winston Churchill. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is $50.1 billion. That was the value of the supplies that were shipped out under the terms of the Lend-Lease Act between 1941 and 1945 during World War II, obviously. Those were supplies shipped out by the United States for its allies, primarily the United Kingdom. And no surprise that arrangement was struck by the leaders of the U.S., Franklin Roosevelt at the time, and the U.K., Winston Churchill, who was prime minister for much of the fighting of World War II. So Churchill's crept back up in the news in the U.S. recently, given a discussion aired by the conservative broadcaster Tucker Carlson, together with a self-proclaimed historian who argued at length that Churchill was the primary villain of World War II. That got a lot of discussion started about Churchill's status, and we thought we'd join in with a bit more of an economic perspective as we try to offer here. So first, though, I wanted to discuss the broader historical question here. So the suggestion in this far-right interpretation was that Churchill was responsible for making World War II a world war in the first place, that he could have kept Britain out of the war, and that fighting need not have broken out the way it did across Europe. And so I'm curious what you make of this interpretation. There were, in fact, peace terms on offer by Germany, Hitler's Germany, in 1940 after France's capitulation. Were those peace terms at all plausibly acceptable for Britain at the time? And yeah, could Britain have just stayed out of the war?
I mean, just to be clear, Churchill is in opposition between 33 and 39. So throughout the early years of Hitler's regime, he was in what he declared the wilderness. So he's hammering on the door of conservative governments, asking for a stronger stance against Mussolini and Hitler, but he's in no position to shape policy in that crucial period. He doesn't enter government until September 3rd, so after Hitler's invasion of Poland. He takes a job at the Admiralty, which was a job he'd had in World War I. And after he then does become prime minister the following year, he retains Chamberlain in government. So Churchill is a sort of outrider of Conservative Party and Conservative governments throughout this period. And what is Tory policy, British Conservative policy in this period about? It's about trying to avoid war, actually. The British Tory governments are leaning over backwards, some would say, to prevent an escalation to World War. Why? Because they do genuinely have horrible memories of World War I. Everyone had lost family members. They consider themselves survivors. They consider war a disaster. And secondly, for strategic reasons, they consider it potentially a complete catastrophe for the British Empire, from which ultimately only the Soviet Union and the United States can benefit at the cost of the world-spanning empire, which had reached its maximum extent after World War I. But the British knew that they were dangling by a thread. Their resources were threadbare. They didn't really have enough resources to defend the empire in its full global reach. And so war for them was a nightmare. And the argument within the Tory party between Chamberlain and Churchill increasingly in the late 30s is whether or not a diplomatic strategy towards Hitler, ultimately backed by the threat of war, which is what then transpires over Poland, because the British give a guarantee to Poland and the French to a guarantee to Poland, which Hitler deliberately violates, or whether, in Churchill's view, this has to be complemented by a more aggressive stance of deterrence. And the reason why the mainstream conservatives don't go harder down the Churchill route is economic, because if the question is the defense of the status quo, how do you define the status quo? Well, one way is thinking of it in terms of empire. Another way of thinking of it is in terms of the balance of the internal political economy of Britain, and defense is expensive, and matching the Germans is very expensive because Germany is driving towards defense spending of 20% of GDP. And then you cannot continue with the famous phrase business as usual. This will disrupt Britain's political economy if you actually chase the Germans. And so this is the balance which the conservative governments are trying to strike. And given a reasonable leadership in Germany, a conservative leadership in Germany that was nationalist military, it would by any reasonable standard have worked, because the position of the British and the French in the alliance backing Poland is a very considerable one. It's a nightmare for Hitler when war actually does break out in 1939. Germany's military leadership are in a position of a coup. The German military resistance against Hitler builds up precisely because the German conservative military leaders can see the risks that Hitler is running and believe that Germany's position is worse than it was in 1914, and so they must therefore do something to prevent war. They never get quite as far as a coup, but around the chief of staff, Ludwig Beck, who's the man who's probably best informed about Germany's military position, there is a group gathering that will ultimately launch the bomb plot in 1944. And so this strategy is working, but it doesn't in the end deter a mad dog like Hitler, who is willing to do something as, from the point of view of ideology, frankly incomprehensible as forming an alliance with Stalin in the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, which gets him as far as making the invasion of Poland safe, which becomes a fait accompli, effectively, because Poland is split between the Soviets and Nazi Germany. But then when it comes to the war in the West, is much less certain. And German victory in May comes as a huge surprise to the British, to the French, to the Germans, to everyone. And on the back of that, then yes, Hitler he would like to have initiated the sort of peace negotiations which appear to have been sketched in Mein Kampf, which was always a strategy for Germany of avoiding a two-front war, looking for a compromise with the British Empire. But the Brits not unreasonably take the view that making a compromise with Hitler when he's effectively come to dominate the entire continent of Europe is in no way in Britain's interest, would ultimately threaten the stability of the British Empire. And so there is this decision to go on fighting. If the point here is that from the point of view of a strategic conservative strategist, the aim of the game here is not to defend liberty and democracy and civil, human rights against Nazism, let alone the Jewish population of Europe, that's absolutely true. But the idea that there's some sort of evil personal plot on Churchill's part to rehabilitate his reputation by continuing with this war is absurd. What is at stake is a calculation about the entrenched interests of the British elite, the maintenance of the British Empire, of which, of course, the British Constitution is part. So they care. I mean, Churchill is a total nostalgic. He writes these histories of the English people. The Magna Carta is shipped out to the Library of Congress so as to build this bond between the United States and Britain. So it's this amalgam of, it's kind of Atlanticist ideology, right? Which is an amalgam of sentiment, values, and strategic calculation, which the British basically gamble that in due course America will have to come in on their side such that they will then be able to continue the war. And that is the German nightmare. I mean, and I've seen it on the inside of the German decision-making system, that precisely is the German nightmare, that alliance will ultimately effectuate, and then they really don't have an answer for the continuation. But the idea that even if there had been a settlement in the 40s, this would have contained the war is really nonsense, because obviously then Hitler's next move would have been to invade the Soviet Union on even better terms than he did anyway in June 1941, right? The project would then not be to settle down and live peacefully. This is what drives German conservative strategists crazy in the Third Reich. So they don't understand why he cannot be satisfied with the huge gains that he's made. And the answer, of course, is from Hitler is you don't understand the real forces at work in the world and not the visible forces of nation states. They are the world Jewish conspiracy, which ultimately forces Germany into this series of increasingly aggressive moves. And that's why the war has to continue. So even if there had been a bargain, as inconceivable as it is, it would have really been the prelude to a further expansion of the war with even more resources in the East.
Yeah, kind of horrific to think about in its own way. But the transatlantic alliance that you were referring to, it found expression, as I mentioned at the start, with the Lend-Lease Act, in which the U.S. supplied Britain with military equipment. I'm curious how that arrangement got negotiated and whether there were concessions that Churchill was obliged to make economically or politically, for that matter. What was Churchill's approach to crafting this alliance, and did the final arrangement meet Churchill's ideal vision for it?
So the backdrop to Lend-Lease is the experience of war finance in World War I, which had been done by way of loans made by the United States and Wall Street to the combatant Entente that is the British-French-Russian alliance in World War I. And that had turned out to be a total diplomatic and political disaster in the 1920s. And on both sides, the Europeans didn't want to end up in that situation again, and the Americans certainly didn't want to. And so the first arrangement, Congress initially tried to block large-scale British and French procurement from the US in the 30s. But in the end, the compromise was cash and carry. So if the Europeans, if anyone in Europe, not nudge, nudge, wink, wink, France, Germany, Italy, anyone can buy goods in the United States that can pay for them and remove them on their own ships, which effectively, of course, rules out the Axis because there's no way they can get a cargo ship across the Atlantic in the face of the British and the French blockade. So what that did was to create a cash and carry basis for British and French procurement, which is how America's rearmament is launched really after 39, is those orders. But by the summer of 40, the British are in dire straits, and they've run out of money. And so the first deal before Lend-Lease is the destroyer for bases deal, where the British basically replenished their navy, the anti-submarine mine-clearing element, the destroyer element of the navy, with a swap of 50 old American destroyers for leases on strategic territory, bases essentially in the Caribbean and in Newfoundland, which were important for America's global ambition. And then after Roosevelt's re-election in November 1940, the negotiations over Lend-Lease begin. And Lend-Lease takes the legal form that it does so as to avoid the problem of loans, right? So this stuff remains effectively American and is lent to the Allies. And it comes with very few strings. Very few strings of a direct quid pro quo kind. Not for nothing. Churchill referred to it as the most unsordid act in history. Compared to the destroyers for bases deal, it's relatively stringless. It comes after the Battle of Britain, with America moving towards ever closer engagement in the war. De facto, of course, what it does is to create massive dependence. Essentially, this is the building blocks of American financial hegemony. It makes the dollar into the principal currency of the world. And it does come with a quid pro quo in the sense that the British Empire is also required to provide free goods to the American military wherever they operate. And that's non-trivial. So the British provide in the order of $7 billion worth of kit to the Americans, notably in the Pacific arena, and then also in Europe. But it's essentially a stitching together of the British and American economies. And so direct quid pro quos are less important here than the overall strategic commitment and the decision by Roosevelt to bind the US economy, right, to make the US economy into the arsenal of democracy. Whether or not America joins the war, it becomes de facto a participant and is seen as such by Nazi Germany from then on in as de facto involved in the war.
So now if we were to shift back a bit to the post-World War I period, this was a time when Churchill was already very active politically. And in reading about that period, it struck me that Churchill was very skeptical of the economic arrangements included in the Treaty of Versailles, which brought World War I to an end. Specifically, he warned about the way that Germany was punished economically in that treaty. And I found it interesting that someone with a conservative background was so sensitive to this kind of punitive peace arrangement. Obviously, he seemed sensitive to the idea that Germany might react with resentment or in fits of national pride against this kind of economic punishment. And Britain had a liberal government at the time that nonetheless saw this treaty through. So I'm curious what Churchill's political perspective, whether there's any conclusions we can draw from that about the intersection of political ideology and international economics and his wariness of the Treaty of Versailles.
Well, for the record, throughout World War I and before, and World War I's immediate aftermath, Churchill is a liberal. So he's in the same party and the same government as Lloyd George. Lloyd George is his partner in power, really. He defected to the Liberals in 1904. He started out as a Tory, an unconventional Tory, but he defects to the Liberals in 1904 because he's a free trader. If you ask about Churchill's economics, they're profoundly conventional, not conservatives as conventional. So he's a liberal free trader and he believes in the gold standard. He was a key figure, in fact, along with Lloyd George in Asquith's radical liberal government of 1906. And between them, there's this amazing photo of the young Churchill and Lloyd George, this dynamic duo who between them basically upend the British Constitution, initiate the move from London to initiate Home Rule. So Churchill even manages to swallow his objections to Irish Home Rule. So he's part of a really radical government, and then returns to power after the Dardanelles disaster, again as part of Lloyd George's coalition that prosecutes the war to the bitter end after 1916. He only goes back to the Conservatives after the Lloyd George coalition, which by that time has changed its spots really quite dramatically, is crushed in the 22 election. Then there's a Labour interlude. And in 24, Conservatives come back, and Churchill is one of the candidates that they sponsor, and he reestablishes his relationship with the party. I mean, he is retrospectively, granted a kind of wisdom and having uttered considerable reluctance about the Versailles Peace Treaty. I have to say, I don't think that's particularly distinctive of him. Many people in both liberal and conservative camps, I mean, the most critical voice after all of the Treaty of Versailles is John Maynard Keynes, who's is a crucial liberal figure. I think the American alignments here shouldn't be transposed all too easily to the British side. What's really distinctive about Churchill, and noted at the time by Philip Kerr, who was Lloyd George's private secretary and key collaborator, is that Churchill was vociferously anti-Bolshevik. So what's really interesting about Churchill is that, he becomes famous for the Iron Curtain speech, and the guy that brought, this is silly, but the idea is that he brought the Cold War to the United States. What is clear is that in Churchill's vivid political and historical imagination, the Russian Revolution the rise of Russian Marxism is a pivotal turning point. And he thinks the big mistake of Versailles is not that, it's not really the terms of the deal with Germany. Everyone could agree that was problematic, and there were reasons why it was problematic, but that they ignored the threat of the rise of Soviet power. And Kerr, writing to Lloyd George, says that I cannot conceal from you that in my opinion, Mr. Churchill is bent on forcing a campaign against Bolshevik Russia by using Allied volunteers, Polish and Finnish, and any other conscripts that can be got hold of, financed and equipped by the Allies. He's perfectly logical in his policy because he declares that the Bolsheviks are the enemies of the human race and must be put down at any cost. But Kerr urges Lloyd George to watch him carefully, because if anything, Churchill wants to expand the war and end it with in fact, if you read his history of the diplomacy and the economic history and political history of the interwar period called Aftermath, he fantasizes about the possibility of a coalition with the Germans against Bolshevik Russia. So it's kind of truly an anticipation of NATO-politan Atlanticism, if you like, as an anti-communist vision. And I think that's the best way to think about Churchill's positioning after World War I. He is preoccupied with the issue of Germany and the possibility of a new war, but he's also looking to the future and this future threat, which will, of course, then be vindicated by the aftermath of World War II.
So then, to conclude, I was curious to fast forward a bit to Churchill's later political career. Churchill served as prime minister during World War II. He then exited that office at the end of the war and then returned a few years later as prime minister. And you mentioned that one of the consistent threads in his politics was an advocacy for the British Empire. And yet his actions during the war made the empire's dissolution ultimately inevitable in some ways. Fighting the war bankrupt the country in ways that made the empire impossible to sustain. And it seems like Churchill himself was then obliged to oversee some of that dismantling. I'm curious how Churchill himself related to that task. I mean, was Churchill ever under the impression in this later part of his career that the empire could still be made to work? Did he resist dismantling it, or did he kind of submit to that inevitability?
Well, I mean, it's important for the record to say the British Empire does function after the war even after World War II, on a really very substantial scale. I mean, all the way through to the late 60s, British military are heavily present in a string of bases that goes Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and through to the Middle East. And it's because of the British military presence through to the late 60s that the American military footprint in the Middle East is as light as it is, because the Gulf states, the Arab states, are all effectively being provided either with British military official support or by way of mercenaries support for their security. And it's the British decision under financial pressure in 1968 to withdraw from what they call East of Suez that triggers America's, prolonged conversation that ultimately ends with the Carter Doctrine of realizing that they need to put boots on the ground in the Middle East, quote unquote, need, right, to stabilize the joint interest there. So what does end after 45 is the Raj, is British rule in the subcontinent, ultimately, India and Pakistan, east and west. And no one could have more forcefully resisted that or refused or dug their head deeper in the sand over that issue than Churchill. And his colonial secretary, Leo Amery, remarked once on the subject of India, Winston is not quite sane. I don't see much difference between his outlook and Hitler's. And this is borne out by the utter callousness with which Churchill treated the horrendous Bengal famine of the war period in which millions have died, and the utter contempt which he maintained towards figures like Gandhi and the Indian nationalists. I think fundamentally we have to think of Churchill as an Edwardian racialist who, as he regularly confided to those who knew him, basically didn't think that people outside the West were capable of democratic self-governance. And he isn't just a theorist, right? So he starts his extraordinary adventuring career in the British Army in India, and he was at Omdurman, so the great battle between the Anglo-British forces and the Sudanese in 1898, and he participated in a kind of Custer's, cavalry charge against the Sudanese forces at Omdurman on the 2nd of September, the last great cavalry charge, the 21st Lancers in British military history. And afterwards, he described that the occasion was glorious because it had given him the chance to indulge his, quote, keen aboriginal desire to kill several of these odious dervishes with his sword, presumably, or his lance. So, he was a practitioner of racial white supremacist rule on a global scale. And this translates at, in every stage, he, as Home Secretary, banned interracial boxing matches so that white fighters wouldn't be humiliated by their black opponents. And much discussed recently in the context of Palestine, he famously declares that, in the interest of allowing a dynamic white population, namely Jewish Zionist settlers, to have their way in creating a new state, he didn't believe that the native Palestinian population should really be given a voice in resisting this, or that let alone that their interests should stand in the way of what he took to be the inevitable march of progress led in this case by Jewish settlers. Ultimately, I think the way the core to understand him is as somebody who is thinking in Atlanticist terms. His racial theory is not limited to, much as the same with Woodrow Wilson, distinguishing between white, black, yellow, and so on, but actually differentiating within the white group very emphatically. And for somebody like Woodrow Wilson, as for Winston Churchill, ultimately this is a question of Anglo-Saxon populations, the famous English-speaking peoples that he thinks of as a propellant force in modern history. And I think the way to reconcile his Atlanticism, his global war making, and so on, is ultimately by way of some fantasy of the special relationship, and that British and American power form natural historical complements to each other, which will be confirmed by the course of 20th and 21st century history.
Well, I think it's fair to say this was all more informative than anything you'll ever hear on Tucker Carlson's podcast. But yeah, we do need to leave the conversation here for now. And obviously, we'll see some of you next week in Washington. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.